In particular, the easternmost row are the North Dakota's noxious weeds. We have 11 in the state, and we have 10 on display, 9 that are living. You probably notice a couple sticks on the end. Well, that's the best I could come up with for one of the plants. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the noxious weeds. The weeds in this row are also perennials, but some are worth discussing, others I'll just give you the answer on and move on because of time. And then the row that's right here, these are the biennial weeds, so that gives you a clue on as you took the quiz. So that's the plan. I'll talk about the noxious weeds, a little bit on selected weeds within these other 3 rows, and I'll either talk a little bit about ID, a little bit about control, and maybe sometimes combinations. In the weed control guide, we've got some nice sections on perennial and a little bit on biennial weeds. I'm going to mention those in case for future reference. But on the weed control guide, pages 55 to 69, has many of our control options for our most common and troublesome perennial weeds. So if you think, oh, he only talked about control today, that's why. I can tell you something today, but it's always best, of course, to look at the weed control guide as well as the label for specifics. The last 2 pages, 68 and 69, are really useful pages because they have a lot of weeds listed and what NDSU's recommendations are for those. And so on all the perennial biennials we have out here, there's only a few where we have no information in the weed control guide. I think I counted last night when I was going through about 5 weeds where we don't have control information on the ones that we have on display for you. So that's good that we have that much information for you. And then also on pages 102 and 105 is a narrative on some of the more common perennial weeds. And this past winter we did update the narrative section for both annual and perennial weeds. As one example is curly dock. We added that narrative just to talk a little bit more because curly dock just in the last couple of years has become more common. Some good places for the weed control guide. It's not all about annual weeds. My first question is, I told you we had 11 noxious weeds. I got 10 on display. Which one am I missing? It's the knapweed. I'll give you that hint. Actually, diffuse knapweed is the one that's missing. All right, number 1, everybody should have got that, right? It's our most common thistle in North Dakota. I'm almost positive that it occupies the largest acreage of that has thistle on it. It is an introduced thistle, and of course it is Canada thistle. Dr. Rod Lim, probably all of you know him. This is especially his perennial noxious weeds. He gets irritated when someone calls it Canadian. It's Canada thistle, so I better repeat that on his behalf. So, how do we identify Canada thistle, if you are wondering? Well, certainly it has a very extensive underground creeping root system, and that's why it's so difficult to control. Above ground, it has the dark green leaves. They're oftentimes shiny. The leaf edges have almost triangular lobes to them, and then of course there'll be a spine on the edge. The Canada thistle has the erect stem, and typically the height is what, anywhere from a foot to maybe 3 at the most, as compared to the next weed, which will be much taller. We do have a lot of thistles in North Dakota. I can't keep them straight, but luckily you have this book in your hand. That's a very good resource for distinguishing the many thistles we have in North Dakota. There's quite a few of them that are native, but this one is not. And I won't get into control because there's just so many options, cropland, non-crop, and so on and so forth, so many products that it's best if you look up that information. So number 1 is Canada thistle. So what is number 2? It's a biennial. Yeah, it is Musk. It does have an extensive root system as well. Well, in particular, not as extensive as Canada thistle, and in particular the second year of growth. Because remember I mentioned it was a biennial. Everything about it is large. When these plants were transplanted and they're not growing as well as they should, you may think this is really strange, but when you try to grow weeds like this, it's really hard. You think anybody can grow weeds, but gosh, you try to isolate them, it's difficult. Okay, back to Musk Thistle. The first year of growth, the rosette growth, it'll get quite extensive. It could be as much as 2 feet wide. If you look at the leaves in particular, yeah, they have some dark green color. They're wavy. There's also wings on the stem, kind of extensions of the stem that are a nice way to distinguish the Musk Thistle from the Canada Thistle. Also, Musk Thistle will have a very prominent midrib that's white in color, and that's a way too to distinguish it from Canada Thistle. When the stem elongates, it'll get very tall, 6 feet, maybe more. And when it flowers, the flower can be as much as 3 inches in diameter, very large, and the bracts that underneath actually resemble a pine cone. So that's another nice clue as to being Musk Thistle versus certainly Canada Thistle. Musk Thistle is also called nodding thistle because the weight of the head is great enough where it actually pulls the top of the stem downward, and that's where they get the name nodding thistle. Control, yeah, let's control it here. Even 2,4-D will do a pretty good job when it's in the first year of growth. The second year, it becomes much more troublesome. Everybody know what number 3 is, right? It's Perennial Wormwood, right? No, of course it's Absinth Wormwood, the perennial. It, like the Canada Thistle, has not as an extensive root system, but very persistent. In particular, the crown of Absinth Wormwood. It seems like even if you do a good job of controlling the above ground growth, there's so much of an energy reserve in that crown that it very likely will regrow. For control of the Absinth Wormwood, this is a good time. The rule of thumb is up to 12 inches or so. Yeah, I know this is a little taller, but still a very young, active growth. And we have a lot of products that will control it, but they probably won't do the trick once. More than likely, it's going to require more than one application. Some products include 2,4-D, Tordon, anything with clear lid is very good on it, and there's many other products as well, and you can look them up in our weed control guide. With Absinth Wormwood, certainly if you need to identify it, just pull a leaf and smell, and it's a gray or silver appearance because not so evident hairs, but many of them that are short give the color that Absinth Wormwood has. Okay, number 4, Leafy Spurge. Of course, everybody knows that. I don't know where to start and stop on discussion on it, but maybe if you want to visit with me later, we can talk about it if you wish. NDSU and other agencies are doing a lot of work with it, have been for many, many years. We're still struggling with it. Dr. Lim, when I asked him what's the very best combination you feel for Leafy Spurge control, he said Tordon and Overdrive. Joel Mayer is here. Joel and I actually have a Leafy Spurge trial on the western part of the county. We put it in about a year ago, and we included a couple of treatments of a new product called Aminocyclopyrachlor, or Perspective. And so I'm anxious to see what those treatments are. When we evaluated 3 months after our treatments, there was a bunch of applicants in that product. The short name for it is called AMP. So I'll refer to it as AMP if you think about discussing it anymore. So lots of work that's been done, continues on Spurge, and we still don't have it controlled, do we? Well, this is Russian knapweed. Is this a biennial or a long-lived perennial? Yes, it is a perennial, long-lived perennial. Fairly aggressive, as are all the knapweeds. So how do we tell the difference between Russian, spotted, which is number 6, and then the one that we don't have the diffuse? Well, because it's a long-lived perennial, if you pull up the plant or dig it up, you'll see the extensive root system. Plus, I had a plant laying around on the root system, it'll be scaly and actually have a darkened color. Almost it looks like it was burnt. So that's a nice clue that this is Russian knapweed versus the other 2, which are biennials or very short-lived perennials. So that's clue number 1 in Russian knapweed. Look at the root system. That'll tell you a lot. That's probably all the further you have to go. In particular, if it's not flowering. Because the knapweeds, when they're just in a vegetative state, it's really difficult to distinguish one from another. but at least we can do that with Russian knapweed. When it does flower and produces the flower and the bracts will have basically a clear membrane as part of the bract, and that contrasts compared to the other two knapweeds. So number 6, I already told you, is spotted knapweed. Would I know for sure if I just came across this plant without managing this arboretum? No way. We got to wait for it to flower and look at the bracts and see that black tip. Well, then we know it is spotted knapweed. We can't rely on the leaves or even on the flower color. We need to look at those bracts. This has allelopathy, or allelopathy, excuse me, properties where it'll put out chemicals in the soil that inhibit the inhibitor. Leafy Spurge that grow next to spotted knapweed. So fairly aggressive, but we do have products that can effectively control it. The last knapweed is diffuse. If you look at the bracts, that's the key. The bracts will have spines that are very easy to see. In fact, the central spine will have a length of about at least a 1/4 inch, even a 1/3 of an inch. It kind of looks like a comb, maybe, if you use your imagination. Some people refer to it as crab-like. But look for those spines in the bracts. You see those? You got diffuse knapweed versus spotted or Russian. Okay, what do we have here? I know we have an unhappy weed, because this is an environment that it likes at all. Anybody know what this is? Well, I'll talk about a little bit. A very extensive root system, like I've been saying for many of the other perennial weeds. It loves water. It is actually a horticultural plant, or a different species, I should say species, but a different type. It's called actually Lythrum. A lot of people have had it in the gardens. Beautiful purple flowers, nice tall plant. But we don't like this one, because it chokes waterways, it displaces other desirable plants. Even wildlife doesn't like it as a cover. If you look at the stems, they'll be 4 to 6 sided. That's where you'll see or you'll be able to feel the different sides to it. It'll get as tall as 8 feet. The flower bearing structure of it, the spikes will get anywhere from 3 inches to 3 feet. Very large. So with that large a spike, what do you think is good for the plant on that? Lots of opportunity to produce seed. And so 2 ways this plant can spread, primarily by water. One is extensive root system. Any pieces that are disturbed for whatever reason, they can float down the river. But more importantly, all the seed that's produced, which can be dispersed by water as well. Control, if you look at a weed control guide, garland and milestone are what we'd suggest starting with to try to control it. The trick is, it's in water typically, and what do you do? So numbers 8 and 9, we have toadflax. So toadflax is in the snapdragon family. Beautiful flowers. This is another escaped ornamental. And then we have 2 of them. They're both perennials. Both have extensive root system. We keep saying that, but it's true for nearly all of our perennial weeds. And very difficult to control. So, on your weed list, you have Dalmation and you have yellow toadflax. So, how do we tell the difference between them? Well, a good start is the leaves. The Dalmation toadflax, it has heart-shaped leaves, and they wrap around the woody stem. As compared to the other one, that looks a lot like Leafy Spurge, doesn't it? But if you tear off the leaves or the stems, there's no milky sac present. So at that stage, confuse the spurge, maybe even kochia. You know, looking at some of these little guys. So Dalmation toadflax, great. Yellow toadflax is number 9. Both very difficult to control, but yellow toadflax even more so. And let me check my notes. We've got a couple of chemicals written down. Yellow toadflax are right now in our weed control guide. Tordon and Overdrive is our best suggestion. I've got a trial in Logan County on yellow toadflax, and after 2 years, Tordon and Overdrive is holding it back quite nicely, but it's not eradicated. We also have AMP in the trial, and that looks really good. Brian Jinks also has had a trial, and he's seen control with AMP 3 years after application. but it's based on rates, based on timing. So we have some more options possibly for yellow toadflax, but keep in mind perspective is not labeled on any type of cropland at this point, only on basically waste areas. Hope that'll change soon. What are these sticks? Yeah, there you go. It's saltcedar, which is sometimes called Tamarix. I actually got this from NDSU's horticulture plantings that they have here in the center, and I stole it from them one day. I needed it in here, but I'm just amazed that it died on me. From all I've read, I thought nothing could kill it, but something happened. So all we have is a stick to knock it down. I guess that's okay. So in North Dakota, it's typically more of a bush compared to a tree. So western states actually have the plant very large as a tree. In North Dakota, typically it's a brush for 5 to 20 feet. It loves water, as I already mentioned, and it takes our water. And what does it give us in place of it? Positive is salt. It stores a lot of salt. That inhibit growth of other plants as well. It's found basically in waterways. It can be controlled by stump treatments or by foliar treatments, but neither one is a surefire where we're going to completely control it. It looks a lot like arborvitae. Probably everyone has a bush in their yard or their neighbors. So it's a kind of a flattened leaf, finely divided, and the plant's also deciduous. So drop its leaves. So a little bit about saltcedar. I don't have any practical experience other than here, and you can see what happened with leaf food around with it. I don't know what I did, but maybe I should share the secret if I can figure it out. Number 11 is stinging nettle, and I'm not going to describe it, but I can jokingly say if you touch it, I bet you'll always remember that, and then you won't have any trouble identifying it in the future. Number 12, what do we have here? Is it wild buckwheat or is it our perennial friend? This is field bindweed. And it's not doing very well here for some reason, but I've already mentioned the frustration was trying to grow weeds alone. But it does have extensive root system. The leaves are arrowhead shaped, fairly long typically, and oftentimes there'll be 3 points to the leaves. Hedge bindweed typically will have 5 points, but don't rely on leaf shape only because you'll be fooled. When the plant flowers, it'll be a nice funnel shaped, showy flower, and if you look below the flower, about an inch to 2 inches, there'll be little projections, little bracts or sepals, I guess they call them. If you see that, well, then you know for sure it's field bindweed, not hedge bindweed, and you know for sure it's field bindweed versus wild buckwheat. Just seeing the showy flower is enough to know that it's not wild buckwheat. It's still a major problem in cropland in certain parts of North Dakota, such as south of here, south I-94 along the Missouri River, Emmons, Logan, McIntosh counties in particular. It's a struggle for those guys and maybe other areas as well. Prairie Sage, number 13. Anybody not know 14? It could be confused with hemp dogbane. This is a native plant, and what insect uses this as its primary food source?
Monarch butterfly.
There you go, Ken. Exactly. So why do we want to kill this beautiful common milkweed? Well, sometimes it happens to get in our crop fields. So if it's in wheat, what do we do? Well, our best suggestions might be a high rate of express or tribenuron with maybe a little dicamba and maybe a little 2,4-D, and it may suppress it during the course of the season. What if it's in our Roundup Ready soybean? Should we just throw a cord on a couple times and that'll do it? No. We need high rates of glyphosate. And then on non-cropland, pastures, anything besides cultivated cropland, we could use Tordon if it fits. Tordon and 2,4-D. So what I'm getting at is very difficult to control. It's got the waxy leaves and extensive root system. Of course, it has a latex in it. How about mosquito spray? Anybody have luck with that? I hear people talk about it. We've had even written reports about it. It's probably a defoliator more than to expect long-term control. 15 is quackgrass. I think I'll skip that. It's very common and should be able to identify it. At least with the other grassy weeds that Shana will talk about, it's certainly contrasts greatly compared to the bromes and foxtails, etc. Of course, it is a perennial weed. So everybody calls this buckbrush, but what's the more accurate name for it?
Snowberry.
Yeah, there you go, western snowberry. So is this really a weed, or is it something good in our pastures and rangeland? I bet we could probably debate about it. It's a good snow catch, good cover maybe for young calves, deer, other wildlife. But some people like to have lots of grass in their pastures, and we don't blame them. So it can be controlled with a higher rate of 2,4-D, and there's other products as well. There's some mixtures from companies that'll work very well. One that comes to mind is Chaparral. They market Chaparral. Dow does specifically for western snowberry. Volunteer elm. You might chuckle that we even had this in here, but this might be an endangered species. Gosh, with all the CRP that's being plowed, all the shelter belts that'll be taken out, we may not have any more volunteer elm in the future. Well, what I really want to get at is it is difficult to control. And in our weed control guide, we have a couple products. One is Crossbow, and one is Tordon plus 2,4-D plus Remedy. So we need to be on top of volunteer plants when they're, well, even tackling this guy is going to be a challenge to try to have complete control. We have Western Yarrow here. Anybody know what this is? It's been very common in roadside ditches through the years, but in particular in wet years. Curly dock. Sometimes called, wild tobacco, some people call it. Number 20, anybody know what this is? Yeah, broadleaf plantain. Very common in abused lawns like I have at my home, or driveways, compacted soils. Reproduces only by seed, but it is a perennial. Everybody knows 21, right? I'll shake your hand if you don't. It's become a real problem in no-till or reduced till. Best controlled in the fall, second best in the spring. Your biggest challenge, if you're up to the challenge, would be during the summer season. In particular in non-Roundup ready crops. So in conventional soybean, dry beans, sunflower, flax. How do we control it effectively, especially established plants? Don't ask me. So, but we have chances in the fall or in the spring. So our general recommendation is if we're with a Roundup ready crop, use a high rate of glyphosate, and then also spike it with Express, and 2,4-D wouldn't hurt either, plus a good adjuvant. And if you're doing this as an early spring application, be careful about the timing, and then when you plant your soybean, for example, because there are some plant back restrictions. This is one of the weeds that was the weed of the year. I think it was in 2009. 22 is a heavy-duty cousin to another annual weed that Shana will talk about. Really difficult to control. It's only in wet areas, usually along field margins. Yeah, swamp smartweed. Okay, 23. This is our weed of the year. If you look at the weed control guide, page 137. We have a whole page written primarily by Brian Jinks on Foxtail Barley. So if you want to know the biology of it, and more importantly control, that'd be a good place to look. It is a bunch grass. It can be fairly easily controlled when it's small. In fact, if you look at page 13, I believe, we got a table there for small grain grass herbicides. We have ratings for a lot of the Group 1 and Group 2 products, including we have foxtail efficacy ratings on that page. The problem is that people wait until it heads, don't they? Before they, oh, I got foxtail barley, now what do I do? Much more tolerant at that stage compared to a little earlier stage. Where's it most commonly found? Yeah, salt-affected soils or in low disturbance cropping situations such as no-till. 24, anybody know what this is? It's not dandelion, it's not prickly lettuce. Salt thistle. What kind of salt thistle? Are you sure?
No.
I'm not either. I'm assuming it is, but there's also marsh, there's also annual, there's also spiny, and there's probably others if we dig hard enough in the literature. But we'll assume this is perennial. So if it is perennial salt thistle, it looks like dandelion, doesn't it? If you tear the leaves, there'll be milky sap. It has the yellow flowers, leaf shape basically like dandelion or like some other weeds. If you look closely though, you see some serration on the leaf margin and even some spines present. So that would take out dandelion, for example. It'll grow quite tall as whatever the weeds or plant species it's competing with. Very difficult to control, actually more so than Canada thistle. And the expert in the state is Richard Zollinger, because he got his PhD from Michigan State, primarily on perennial salt thistle. It used to be on the noxious weed list. It was taken off. I'm not sure why, but still difficult weed to control. 25 is white top, is one name for it. It used to be on the noxious weed list. Extensive root system, as I keep saying. So what's the real name for it, or the name on your quiz?
Hoary Cress.
Yeah, Hoary Cress. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about it. I think it's in the southeast part of the state. It seems to like water, and but doesn't appear to be much of a threat. I'll just give you the names of these three weeds, and then we'll end up with one on the end. 29. It is called Goatsbeard. The real name I have trouble saying, so I'm going to let someone else say it. Good. That's number 29. 28, this weed, if you haven't felt the leaves, do so. You would think maybe it's velvet leaf or something. Really feels good. And I grew up in west central Minnesota. We had lots of it there. I know you have some in the western part of North Dakota and into Montana. But why don't we have it in the eastern half of North Dakota? Someday I'm going to dig that up and find that answer. These, as I mentioned earlier, are common, or biennials. Well, this is common mullein. Just think how hard it is to wet that with the herbicide, to get the herbicide into the leaves because of the feel of it. Real challenge. This can be confused with common cockleburr, at least if you look at the seed. More of a waste area, biennial weed, common burdock. And this is in the first year of growth, of course. And the last one is one that may be a very likely candidate to get on the noxious weed list. Again, it's a biennial. We want to control it when it's this stage, not this stage. Anybody know what it is? It's becoming really common, at least in the northern part of the state. Houndstongue. So note the leaf shape. It could be confused with maybe dock. Fairly easy to control with even 2,4-D at that stage. Notice the flower color, kind of nice to look at. Notice the nutlets. There's typically 4 present. And each nutlet is lens shape, teardrop shape. If you notice the barbs on each one of these nutlets, very readily will stick to, when they're mature, stick to your pants, animals, fur, etc. So it very readily spreads. It does have alkaloids in it, so it is a threat to livestock. So please make sure you are able to identify this before you leave today, because you'll likely encounter it not so much in cropland. In fact, it's unlikely in cropland, but other areas.
Number 30. Who knows that one? Shepherd's purse. Yep, good job, you got it. Forms a rosette, irregularly toothed and incised margins and entire margins. Upper surface of the true leaves are slightly hairy. Let's see, one plant can produce 40,000 seeds that are long-lived. And then obviously the flowers are white and the fruit is a distinctive heart shape. It's a little bit easier to tell when it's mature. Okay, 31. I actually have this in my yard right now.
Flixweed?
Flixweed. Yes, thank you. It's the same genus as tansy mustard. It's part of the mustard family. It's introduced, but it closely resembles the native plant. The first true leaves are 3-lobed. The other leaves are finely divided in gray-green and covered with fine hairs. And then it's odorless. 32. Kind of has a catchy name. Night flowering catchfly. Leaves appear in pairs, spoon-shaped and widen towards the end before tapering to a point, and there's hairs on the margins. It competes well in pastures, but it's not palatable to livestock. The flowers are white, yellow, or pink, and often are fragrant, and they open at night. It's sticky when you squeeze it as well. 33. This was a crop, I'd say crop, loosely. Was looked into for bioenergy. It may still be, but does anyone know what that one is? It's also called fanweed, stinkweed, or Frenchweed.
Pennycress.
Pennycress, real pennycress. The first leaves appear in a rosette, and the leaves then alternate. Stems have no hair. Okay, 34.
Prickly lettuce.
Prickly lettuce, the crop. It's a serious, serious problem in crop plants. Leaves are alternate, oval to spatulate shaped. Margins are irregular toothed with soft spines. And then what's the distinctive characteristic of it? The midrib has the spines. That's how you find that one. And then the older seedlings have a milky sap. 35. I brought this one from Minot. Green flower pepperweed. 36. It reminds me of something you eat. Rough cinquefoil. 37. This one is more of an issue up in Minot, north of Minot, north central North Dakota, especially in small grain crops. It has white flowers. It's called daisy.
Called what?
False chamomile. Daisy. Think of a daisy. False chamomile. It's tolerant to many of the herbicides I use in small grains, although tillage kind of controlled the fall emerged. And its cousin is actually the pineapple weed. You guys can see that. Okay, 38. Okay, I brought this with. And this is when they're mature, so you can kind of see the inflorescence. Hopefully everyone looked at that. Thank you, Irene. So 38 and 39. Which one's which? 38 is downy, 39 is Japanese. And 38 is also called what? Cheatgrass. And someone said it cheats you out of yield. It cheats because it starts emerging before other crops. And the way to tell the difference is the hair on downy brome looks like a crew cut, and the hair on Japanese brome is more soft. That's kind of how. Has anyone seen Japanese brome? I guess the main thing is to remember is that make sure you know if it's downy or Japanese. The proper ID is the key, because we have seen that, so it's important to know that it's not just downy or Japanese. Okay, 40 and 41. Which one's which?
Green foxtail.
Which one's which?
That one's green foxtail. That one's yellow.
Yes, you're correct. And how do we tell the difference between green and yellow?
Yellow's got a flat stem.
Yes. And what else?
Long hairs.
Longer hairs on the yellow. 42. Waldo, thank you. Who got that one? So it's difficult to control because the seed shatters before harvest. Cultural control, delayed seeding. The leaf twist is counterclockwise. Has no auricles, and there's hairs on the leaf margins, and it has membranous leaves. Okay, 43. Common cocklebur. Cotyledons are waxy and thick with that dark green upper surface.
Got one right.
Yeah. These are alternate, triangular, or heart-shaped. It appears similar to sunflower. It's poisonous to livestock because it contains hydroquinone. 44. I used to work in pulse crops all the time, and this is a bad weed for pulse crops. Redwood pigweed. Similar in appearance to Palmer amaranth and can actually hybridize with Palmer amaranth, and that's a problem because most of the Palmer amaranth is resistant to almost all chemistries, especially from the south. The stems have lines or ridges, and then the taproot is pink or red in color. It's a strong competitor for nitrogen and water in croplands. Okay, 45. We got rid of the redwood pigweed, so what's left? Prostrate pigweed, 46. This is a pretty easy one, I think. Okay, we got Sycamore, right? You got common mallow. It has that fan-shaped leaf. Flowers have 5 petals that are usually white with dark violet veins. 47? Lamb's quarter. And what's hard about lamb's quarter? Difficult. Control issue. There's a lot.
It's not bad to kill when it's little. When it's big.
Confused with redwood pigweed? I don't see it, but it might be at small stages. Often causes hair fever. It's a member of the goosefoot family, which includes kochia. It's hard to wet because of the leaves. So you have to make sure you get that. 48. This is the first weed documented in the U.S. with resistance to glyphosate. Also called mare's tail, horseweed. It's also resistant to paraquat, atrazine, and ALS herbicides. Emerges in the fall and overwinters as a rosette. But it also can germinate in the spring. 49, marsh elder. 50 is a big problem.
Water hemp?
Water hemp. It's a member of the pigweed family. What's I think is unique about water hemp is the plants are either male or female. So dioecious. It can produce up to 5 million seeds that remain viable for 4 years. It's well established in eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota. Confirmed resistance to group 2, 4, 5, 9, 14, and 27 chemistries. And that's a weed we want to have zero tolerance, so even if that includes hand weeding, just to get rid of a few plants, that's pretty important. 51. This is found in a lot of wet areas. Lady's thumb, a very strong competitor, and it's naturally tolerant to 2,4-D and MCPA. The cotyledons attach at a 180-degree angle when you look at it from above. 52. This survives a lot of pre- and post herbicides, and it's often mistaken for common ragweed. It's scented when you bruise it as well. 53. This is another troubling weed in pulse crops, especially.
Buckwheat?
Buckwheat. There's very few chemical options, especially in some of the broadleaf crops, to control this. It climbs similar to field bindweed as well. 54.
Kochia?
It likes salty soil. It's very competitive, and it also can germinate when it's the soil moisture is really low. That's a problem. The glyphosate-resistant kochia in North Dakota was found in 2011, and it spread about 2/3 of the state last year. Has anyone seen any new additional resistant kochia fields this year so far? Not yet. One weakness of kochia is that the seeds will, only 5% of the seeds will germinate the next year. So that's one thing to consider. Let's see, it's resistant to 2,4-D, MCPA, and ALS. And we don't want to overuse the PPO groups to control it, because that's how we lost the other chemistries as well. But we still have chemical options to control it. 55. Russian thistle. Yep. It has the long, fleshy, needle-like leaves. Moderate to strong competitor. After the crop emerges, it's less competitive. And it's also called what? Tumbleweed. Yes. And actually, Russian thistle was introduced to the United States through North Dakota from flaxseed from Yarrow. So that's your little important little tip for that one. 56. Similar to a crop that we have a lot of in North Dakota.
Wild mustard.
Wild mustard. Yep. And how do we tell wild mustard from canola?
Waxy leaves.
That'll die from
There you go. That would probably die from hunger. It has stiff hairs on the main stem, where canola has a smooth stem. So that's how you can tell the difference, just by feeling the stems. Okay, 57. You're correct. We're seeing a lot more common ragweed with soybean and dry bean acres. It's common in cropland. They have separate male and female flowers as well. There is resistant biotypes to glyphosate, ALS, and PPOs. It's definitely important, and I like to stress this a lot with soybean and corn, to use a pre-emergence herbicide other than Roundup with some type of residual. Unfortunately, this year was not a good year for pre-applications, but that's how we control it the best. And then what do we not like about ragweed? Allergies. It's a pretty major source of hay fever. 58.
Purslane.
Yep. Oh, the one thing about purslane is that when you cut it off, it can regrow the roots. So if it's in your garden or something, you want to remove the tissue that you pull off. 59. What kind of sage? Lance leaf sage. You know what else it's called? In like Nebraska. Lamb's leaf sage. And how can you distinguish this sage?
Rub it and smell the fingers.
Has a square stem. Yep, so if you try to roll it, it's square. But this one isn't big enough yet, I guess, so that's how you can tell. And then it's also fragrant, of course. What's 60? Hairy. What's 61? Eastern black. Okay, how can you tell the difference? It's easier to tell when they're flowering. The hairy nightshade, the berries form like similar to grapes, where Eastern black, the berries are more like an umbrella. But do we want to wait that long? It's poisonous, it's toxic. The berries are less toxic as the plant matures. And then it's different. It's important to know which is which because, for example, Bassagran will work on hairy nightshade but not Eastern black. And Everest 2.0 will work on Eastern black but not hairy. Oh, my extra credit weed. It really likes wet conditions. I took it in Minot. I don't know. It's probably found everywhere, but we saw a lot of it 3 years ago, and then we saw a lot of it this year. And Brian Jenks told me that 3 years ago, half the emails he received about weed ID was this weed.
In crops or?
Well, yeah, I found it in cropland. But it likes the water. I found it in a field that was absolutely disgusting. Just salt and... Northern willow herb.